Hello, this is the Disaster Recovery Pro, and this is my video series discussing key topics in information technology with a focus on disaster recovery and business continuity. In today's presentation, we're going to take a look at how the RTO, or Recovery Time Objective, can mean different things in different contexts, depending on your perspective. We'll also take a look at how in some contexts, the term SLA, or Service Level Agreement, may be more appropriate than RTO. Let's start by defining our terms. We can quickly review the definition of RTO, or Recovery Time Objective. This is the maximum amount of downtime that your business, site, or business function can withstand after a disruptive event. Recovery must be completed before the RTO expires. In other words, this is your amount of allowable downtime in the event of a disaster that defines how much time you have to get your business back online. A service level agreement, or SLA, is a commitment between a service provider and a client. Particular aspects of the service, such as quality, availability, responsibilities, are agreed to between the service provider and the user, including penalties for missing agreed upon service metrics or targets and exceptions to the agreement. Now, the problem that we have is that the term RTO is often applied to different contexts, but using the same term. It can mean something different to a business continuity planner, a disaster recovery planner, or a recovery service provider or a vendor. It's often used where the term SLA would be more appropriate, and that could very well be a source of confusion that you're not going to be able to afford in a real crisis situation. Now, the distinction between the two terms might not be all that obvious on the surface level, but we're going to take a little closer look at that in the next few slides and see if we can clear that up. If you remember back to our very first video where we talked about the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity, the main point was that business continuity has a broader perspective than just disaster recovery. From the business continuity perspective, as soon as your disruptive event or disaster occurs, the clock starts ticking, and your RTO, or recovery time objective, is the time between an actual event and your resumption of operations. Now, that includes a whole lot of things that just the disaster recovery people may not consider. That includes your first responders, your incident response team that's going to be first on site and is going to be making those initial decisions. Your communications team that's going to be getting information out to everybody and coordinating with outside agencies if necessary. Your operational logistics, all the arrangements that you need to do to get people and equipment where they need to be. These are all activities that the business continuity professional needs to account for and plan for in case of a disaster. Disaster recovery, especially the technical part, is just a piece of that responsibility. In most business continuity frameworks and plans, your incident response team has some responsibilities that they have to take care of, some of which have a higher priority than actually declaring a disaster, which would start your disaster recovery phase. When we take a look at the RTO from the perspective of a disaster recovery planner, we can start to see where there may be confusion. For the disaster recovery planner, the clock starts when the disaster is declared, when that incident response team has made the decision that the disruptive event is bad enough that we have to go and activate our alternate site or our technology recovery plan or whatever the case may be. The disaster recovery planner is responsible for the time between the disaster declaration and when their tasks are complete and ready to hand off to the business. This differs from the business continuity planner's perspective because the business continuity planner has to also account for the actions that need to lead up to that disaster declaration. They're also responsible for accounting for any activity that has to take place after the recovery is complete to actually resume normal operations that may involve getting people where they need to be or possibly coordinating business startup activities with outside entities like business partners in your supply chain or distribution network. The thing that you want to be careful about is that you've got two different perspectives that use the term RTO most of the time to describe two very different things. So I would suggest as a business continuity planner that you refer to the recovery execution time as a service level agreement, whether it's with an internal group or an external vendor or provider just to avoid confusion, so you don't have this term RTO showing up in different documents and having it mean different things. So let's examine the difference between these two perspectives a little bit more closely. In business continuity practice, the first response to any disaster event is your incident response plan. The first and highest priority duty of incident response is to ensure life safety and accounting of all personnel that may have been affected by the disaster. And this needs to be coordinated with outside agencies such as police, fire, EMTs, rescue squads, etc. The second duty and priority is assessing, mitigating, and containing damage to facilities, also working in conjunction with outside agencies. Then the third priority is assessing, mitigating, containing hazardous material issues, also in conjunction with outside agencies. The next priority is to establish communications, send out notifications, and activate your emergency operations center if you have one. And then once we've established these other critical responsibilities, then the incident response team needs to decide when and if a disaster declaration is required and start the remote site activation plan. Incident response cannot skip right ahead to activating a recovery site. They have to first make sure that everybody's safe, damage is mitigated, and there's been some sort of assessment and establishment of communications first. Recovery plan activation often involves an outside vendor or provider who's probably going to require a formal disaster declaration in order to mobilize their staff, their equipment, and start their recovery execution. And like we discussed on the previous slide, whether you're using an internal DR team or a DR vendor or provider, their RTO, quote unquote, typically starts at the time of disaster declaration, not necessarily at the time the event actually happens. With that in mind, the business continuity planner needs to account for the lead time needed by the incident response team and any post-recovery logistics that are needed. In this case, it's often better to express the RTO as a service level agreement just to avoid confusion, just so that you don't have that term showing up in different places and meaning different things. Outside vendors or providers, they really like to use the term RTO internally, which is going to be outside of your control. But as the business continuity planner, in your documentation, in your business continuity plan, it will probably be clearer if you only use the term RTO to refer to your RTO, that's the time between an event and resumption of duties, and refer to the time allotted to the vendor or provider as your service level agreement with them. So what are the lessons and considerations that we can take away from this as a business continuity planner? An important takeaway is that you need to be aware that the disaster recovery team is going to need notification with enough time to execute their tasks where your overall RTO might be at risk. This means that your incident response team is going to have a cutoff time. There will be a point where the incident response team is going to have to commit to either going into recovery or not going into recovery. And that decision point needs to leave the recovery teams with enough time to execute their tasks and still have the business continuity plan meet its overall RTO. So if your overall RTO is 24 hours and your disaster recovery team needs at minimum 12 hours to complete their tasks, you know that 12 hours after that disaster point is when your incident response team is going to have to commit or not commit. Otherwise, they're going to be at risk of missing their RTO. Likewise, your incident response plan should also balance the issues of declaring disaster too soon against the RTO risk of declaring too late. This is especially evident when you use an outside recovery vendor or provider for disaster recovery. They may be on a first-come, first-served basis for regional disasters. So if you have a large hurricane and lots of companies in your area are declaring disasters, you're going to need to get in there, otherwise your resources may be taken up by somebody else. You also have to consider that an outside vendor or provider is probably going to have disaster declaration fees that start when you call them and declare disaster. So if you call too soon and then decide that you don't need them, you're still going to be paying those disaster declaration fees. So there is a little bit of a balancing act that you have to do there. In general, you want to err on the side of caution. It's probably better to declare too soon than to declare too late, but you do need to take that early declaration cost into consideration as well. And lastly, when you plan your service level agreements or RTO with your disaster recovery team or outside vendor or provider, you need to account for that incident response time and also account for any post-recovery tasks or logistics that you need to resume business operations once your recovery site is up. Thanks for watching today's presentation. If you found this topic interesting and you want to learn more about disaster recovery and business continuity, you can help support the channel by leaving a comment to tell me what you thought about it, clicking like on the video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so that you won't miss out on my next video. Your support and feedback is very important, so thank you for watching and supporting the channel, and have a great day.